Well, I have been blessed. Thank you for inviting me to come across and chat to you this morning. But I just want to take a minute just to say thank you, Tom, for your prayer. It really did resonate with me, and I did hear a little gentle whisper from the Lord during your prayer. There's a gentleness there and a humility and a deep love for God that I really appreciate this morning, mate. Here we go. I pastored a Baptist church. My wife and I planted a Baptist church, actually, and we pastored that church for 22 years before starting at Youth Dimension. All front seats always empty. I don't know why. I don't know if they got wind of your COVID scare or whatever it is, or it's always empty. So I feel like you're a long way back. So I've taken my glasses off. I can't see you. All just fuzzy faces. And we'll talk this morning. I want to talk about something that is so fundamental to motivation for life, but so fragile. So we'll get through there and to that with God's help this morning. And I do pray that it's useful to you and your understanding of this area of wellbeing, but also for folks that you will know where this very fundamental but fragile component is perhaps fading for them. So if you've got a Bible, I hope you have, or a phone with a Bible on it, why don't we open to one of my favourite books in the Bible, the book of Isaiah chapter 40, and we'll look at verse 28 in a minute. Now while you're doing that and thumbing, no one thumbs through a Bible anymore, do they? It's all online, this and that. I've got a Bible, I'm a bit old school. Part of my research in the area of wellbeing was in India. And I spent a lot of time in India and Nepal, actually, but in India. And I remember the first trip to India was working with people affected by leprosy, and my research was looking at the impact of leprosy on the wellbeing of those people affected by it. And I remember arriving in the airport there at Delhi. We drove a long, long way out into the countryside to another small village. And within the compound, the leprosy compound, the big steel gates opened up. There was barbed wire curled around the walls. And in we drove. We drove past the hospital I was working in and then to where I was going to spend the next however long, couple of weeks. This little tiny shack in the middle of the forest, in the middle of this campus. Door swung open, they threw my bags in. There you go, Lindsay, see you in the morning. Okay, turned a very dull light on, found my bedroom, tried to go to sleep. I've got to say, I don't get nervous too easy. I'm a little nervous. I don't even know why I was nervous, but I was a little nervous. Let's lose this, will we? I'll just hold it, that might be better. I was a little nervous. Anyway, I think I managed to almost fall asleep when all of a sudden, the heck is that? The heck? Oh my goodness me. I tried to just ignore it. At some point, falling asleep. The next morning I go out, and I kid you not, the door was this thick. It was a proper door. And right at the bottom, just probably the height of a very large rat, was scratch marks. And night 2, night 3, night 4. By night 5, this thing was as thin as a cheap suit, the door. And I thought, this bad boy is trying to bust through. For whatever reason, he wants me. I'm sitting in there barricaded. I'd sprayed this thing with fly spray, the door and everything. Nothing was stopping him. And then I remembered how I used to kill rats as a boy. You fill up half a bucket of water, you pop in some food, the little ramp, the rat climbs up, oh, free lunch, jumps in, and then drowns. Doesn't take very long. So I got him. Slept like a baby. That little rat went to rat heaven. It was all good. I tell you this story, well, not to, for any reason other than introduce another story about rats. A very famous experiment, actually. that I remember doing in my undergrad psychology, reading about this, where a researcher got a bucket of water and put some rats in it just to time how long they could swim before they die, before they drown. Not very long. The other bucket of water that he had, he put similar rats in and started the clock. But this time, after about the first minute, he reached in, he lifted the rats out and then plopped them back in. So it made a difference. Minutes before drowning, hours and sometimes days for this lot. And this is a very famous conclusion. He thought, why on earth would this lot live so much longer than that lot? One word, and it's in the scientific literature: hope. This bucket of rats for a moment had hope. And hope makes a difference. This is what I want to chat sort of round and through this morning. Hope. Because you will know people, if you haven't already, experienced hope draining out of your life. Hope is the thing amongst another sort of little cluster of things that we'll sort of unpack this morning that gives you motivation for life. And sometimes until you don't have it, you don't even realise you've got it. But I will tell you, you will know somebody, you will be up very close to somebody in your world who right now, as we're sitting here, whose hope is draining. And I want you more than anything else. Our slogan at Youth Dimension is to give a generation hope. Every single morning I get up and I think about, in school context, how can we do that? And we have all sorts of mechanisms for us to go into a high school and give young people hope. But you have people in your world you've hope to as well. So I want to start a little conversation around this issue of hope. Let's read this text together, and then we'll jump into a little bit of science. We'll overlay that with the gospel, and then we'll wrap it up and go home and have a roast after the forum. Is that all right? And our baptisms, that's awesome. Okay, so Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 28. Do you not know? You all do. Have you not heard? You hear it every single Sunday. The Lord is an everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired and weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary. He increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary. I don't know that the youths, though, would laugh at your jokes at safari camp. I tried dad jokes, take them for a run around the block. I'm not sure if folks are laughing at me anymore or with me, so I think it's the latter. Even youths grow tired and weary. Even young men stumble and fall. But here it is. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run, they will not grow weary, and they will walk and not be faint. Those who hope, those who wait with patient expectation on the Lord will renew their strength, run, walk, maintain motivation for life. Those who hope in the Lord. And we'll get there. Ultimately, folks need Christ. Some of you may be a little disconnected from Christ. We need to reconnect with Christ because that Christ is the source of that hope, which brings that motivation for living. I want to take a little deep dive under the bonnet of every single human being on the face of the planet, and then we'll come back up and apply the gospel to that. So if you can bear with me, let me try and sort of chat through some of the scientific stuff around well-being, around hope in particular, and then we'll come up for air and we'll try and see what difference to us as Christians does the gospel make in this whole area. Obviously, we've hinted at that. Those who hope in the Lord renew their strength. So we've been, let me just turn around, I will put my specs on for this. As I said, Youth Dimension's very interested in giving a generation of young people hope because it is so fundamental to life, but it is so fragile. So that's what we do. So with my work at Youth Dimension and another organisation that I work with called the Australian Centre on Quality of Life and another one called the International Wellbeing Group, we've been measuring the well-being of people all around the world for a couple or 3 decades. In an Australian context, in Nepal, in India, in America, all over the world. And one question that is part of a suite of questions that we ask when it really wants to sort of a group like us to get under the bonnet and figure out what is going on in a population's life, if you like, is we ask folks a question like this. And I'd like to ask you this morning, don't yell it out. Thinking about your life as a whole, how satisfied do you feel? This is a very important, fundamental question that helps us at least begin the journey into the well-being of people, how they answer this question. So 0 being, obviously, I've got no satisfaction at all in my life. Number 10, if you say, yeah, 10, I'm completely satisfied. I couldn't be any more satisfied. I'm full. I've got no more room. I'm totally satisfied. And, of course, all the numbers in between. I wonder which number you would choose. Well, let me tell you what number you chose. You're the same as everyone else in the whole entire world. They said, yeah, about a 7.5 out of 10. At a population level, and it doesn't matter if it's a school population that we go in and work with and measure the levels of well-being, or a country's population, we've done it in Australia here for 20 years at least, the average at a population level is about 7.5, give or take a couple of percentage points. 75% if you want to put it onto a broader scale, percentage scale. So as scientists, as boffins in a lab, we wonder about results like this. What would explain something like that? And when we see this at such vast quantities of different populations, so diverse, in India, exactly the same. In Nepal, exactly the same. In Australia, the same. America, the same. Czechoslovakia, anywhere we go and do this, it's the same. The conclusion that is drawn and almost has to be drawn is that there's something hardwired in our DNA as people to return a result like this. We are created by God. Now, of course, the boffin lab that I work in don't know God. We do, but we are created by God to have a certain level of well-being, a certain level of motivation for life that'll get us up in the morning and expect that we're going to be able to do and enjoy the sorts of things that we would like to do today. God has created us to be like that, around about 75% of a scale maximum. That's wonderful. We are hardwired to go reasonably well. Now, as we'll see in a minute, obviously not everyone in the room here answered 7.5. Lots of folks, in fact, exactly 4.4% of any population in the world, whether it's a school or a country, 4.4% of the population will answer at 50% or below. What we notice with a group that are answering those sorts of questions is that depressive symptomologies, mental health concerns correlate very strongly with a number like that. Very few, there are a few, way up on the other end of the scale. What we find is that like being too low, being too high is dysfunctional and associated with all sorts of other problems which I won't bore you with. It seems to be God has hardwired us to go fairly well. Now, as we'll see in a minute, that doesn't mean that as you are sitting here at 75% of a scale maximum, going reasonably well, that the wheel nuts can't come loose and the wheels fall off at points in your life. We know that to be true. Next week, if that's you, if that's somebody else, I think we're going to talk a little bit here at Croydon Hills about, well, what can we do as a faith community to support more fully folks who aren't sitting perhaps at the 75% in the scale maximum. But we need to explain this a little bit more. As I said, we've been measuring this and returning these results in an Australian context for more than 20 years. We could actually, we know this to be true, and I'm sorry for going a little bit deeper under the bonnet than what we have already, but we could actually change that word satisfied and put, well, all sorts of other words in there and get exactly the same result. And we'll get to why that's important that you realise that. Excellent. We can place words about how we're feeling, and very famously on this circumplex model of effect. We have a horizontal axis there. I think, is that cut off or is it my eyes? Activation's the word, like excited, high energy, and obviously the opposite of that way down here. On the horizontal one, we've got an unpleasant and a pleasant plane. So we can place a word like anxious. We know where to place that. We place it here. It's obviously high levels of activation, but it's unpleasant, so we can place that there. We can place a word like depressed if we're feeling depressed on this same model. Obviously deactivated, low levels of energy, and again, equally unpleasant. We place a word happy round about there. When we go into a school with particularly young people, we don't ask the question, how satisfied do you feel with your life? We ask the word, how happy do you feel with your life? Because we know that content or satisfied, those two words cluster together. Content, happy, satisfied. They cluster together. Now, they're not exactly the same, obviously, but when we receive data asking those different questions, it's very, very similar. And it's nice to be able to go into a high school and say, how happy do you feel with your life, knowing that we're getting very similar results to the word satisfied. If you've got a Bible, the reason this is important is Philippians chapter 2, or chapter 4 actually. Let me read it for you. So this is Paul. I have learnt to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether we're hungry, well-fed, so on and so forth. And you realise Paul was in any and every possible situation. We know that we can swap out the word content. I've often wondered about this biblical text. I can swap the word satisfied in my research over the last 20 years, and I could put the word content in there and get exactly the same result. Do you know what that implies to me? It means that Paul's level of contentment is exactly the same as everybody else in the world. Paul's level of contentment is no higher whether you're a follower of Jesus or you're found somewhere in another continent following some other god little g. Paul's level of contentment, his level of contentment is exactly the same. This is very interesting to me. Very interesting, because I ask, well, what is Paul talking about here then? Let me help you sort of unpack this a little bit more. So I've learnt the secret of being content, satisfied, happy in any and every situation. Can I tell you that our well-being, our levels of contentment, our satisfaction are absolutely analogous or work exactly the same way as our core body temperature. Our core body temperature has a what? Anyone know? A set point. It's very important to have it at that set point. It's very bad if it fluctuates too far away from that set point. It has all sorts of physiological functions, sweating, shivering, all these sorts of things, because it is so important to maintain our core body temperature at or around its set point. It's exactly the same when it comes to our well-being, our levels of contentment, our levels of satisfaction, our levels of hope. They are so fundamentally important to us as people that we have all sorts of psychological mechanisms to work in the same way to maintain it within a very narrow range of values. Let me tell you what some of these protective mechanisms are, and you'll begin to start to look through the lens of the gospel as we go through this list. So first of all, we won't go into all the details, but we have habituation. I have an office that's overlooking a very main road. When I first moved into the office, looking over Tram Road, it was like, oh, that's so noisy, and everyone that came in, oh, so noisy. I go in there now and I don't even hear it. That's habituation. There's a constant stimulus in our world, and we get used to it, so used to it we stop noticing it. Adaptation, an invasive event, I have a car accident, I become disabled in some way as a result of that. Initially, you might go, hey, Linz, think about your life as a whole right now. How satisfied do you feel? Well, I'm not feeling very satisfied at all. Just had an accident. Ask me 6 to 18 months, and the research tells me without any other change in circumstances, I'll go, yeah, that's 7.5 out of 10. Nothing's changed other than I've adapted to the situation. Money is a very important mechanism. In fact, it's probably one of the biggest and most significant all around the world. Not because money makes us happy. We know from research it absolutely doesn't. But it buys and produces utilities that support our well-being, particularly when they're under threat. I can go and see a psychologist if I can afford it, a psychiatrist, I can go to my GP, I can afford medication, or all sorts of other things that can protect that core body temperature. In our case, our levels of satisfaction, contentment, happiness, or hope. The other one we've got here, and these are intuitive, personal relationships are very important as far as protective mechanisms when it comes to our well-being. Fundamental, we sort of know that. This is why at a community level, places like this are fundamentally important. Achieving in purpose, this is another big one. In fact, it's one of the three big ones. We need to feel we are achieving in life. This is a fundamental protective mechanism to our levels of well-being, satisfaction, happiness, contentment. In fact, we did a very big study, I won't tell you where, but with aged care, and one of the fundamentally difficult components associated with the well-being of people in aged care is a continual loss of a sense of purpose and achieving in life. We've seen this in church contexts with older folk, hardwired with so much experience, so much wisdom, but no context or mechanisms to express that, and the achieving and the sense of achieving in life and purpose diminish, and just coincidentally so does levels of contentment, happiness, satisfaction with life, and so on. A very big one. Another very important one is self-esteem. Gets a bad rap. We never actually ask or work with this word self-esteem. Essentially what it means is, if I was going to test your level of self-esteem, I would say something like this: thinking about your life as a whole, how worthwhile do you feel? Of course, the gospel's got nothing to say to that. You can't say tongue-in-cheek. But at a fundamental level, right across the world, feelings of worthwhileness are fundamentally important to protect our well-being. I hope you're listening through a lens of if you know somebody. How could I help them? I mean, someone I know went through a very difficult patch. We put 3 little scriptures up on the wall, and every time this particular person walked past these 3 scriptures affirming that you are worthwhile, for example. Optimism and hope, we're coming to hope now, is fundamentally important, as is perceived control. Perceived control is not objectively how much control you have, but how much control you feel you have in your world. You will probably have known somebody impacted by violence of some sort, domestic violence perhaps. Obviously, that the perceived control, a sense of being out of control, has replaced the sense of control and levels of contentment and well-being, and these other things are suffering as a result. These things are designed to protect our core body temperature, and I say core body temperature, meaning, of course, our levels of contentment, our motivation for life, whatever other phrase or construct of its type you want to put in there, satisfaction, or Paul's word, contentment. Paul's contentment is protected in the same way as every single person in this room by habituation, adaptation, financial resources, personal relationships, achieving purpose, self-esteem, how worthwhile we feel as people, how optimistic, how much hope we have, and our levels of perceived control. So on that basis, I'm very confident to say that Paul's level of contentment is exactly the same as ours. Now, that's not to say, and again next week we'll pick it up, that this system, this magnificent, created by God in his sovereignty, this system designed to protect our levels of well-being can't be overwhelmed. And it is. There are contexts whereby our levels of contentment are dragged out of its very tightly held range of values. We know that. I just said to you that 4.4% of the population, 4.4% of this church perhaps, their level of contentment has been dragged out, and they're sort of saying, well, I've got probably 50 or 40% of a scale maximum. If you're thinking about your life as a whole, how content do you feel? 40, 50? It's been dragged out. It's under threat. And the protective mechanisms are being engaged, but that goes on long enough like that, and this whole system's overwhelmed. And we see things like depression. Resilience. I mean, there's all sorts of work in words thrown around in school context. One of these is resilience. There's nothing really in a school context that's being given to our school children really, honestly, that deals with this particular construct in any scientific way very well. But resilience essentially is, well, how hard is it to drag me out of my very narrow range of values? How hard is it? How well do my mechanisms work? How hard is it? Then if I do, well, then how quickly can the whole system restore itself to put me back in that narrow range of well-being values that is fundamentally important for my motivation for life? That's resilience. How hard is it, and then how quickly can I get back there? Now, obviously, it can be overwhelmed. Now, you will know some people whose systems have been overwhelmed. And Lord willing, next week, folks will come in here and will tell you as a faith community how you can support people like that. No doubt you'll find some things, if you're in that category of folks as well, that you'll be able to use as well. So back to this, and we'll finish. Paul's level of contentment is the same as everybody else, but his resilience is not. This is my conclusion. You can wrestle me over it later. My hunch is that his level of resilience is not. And I think it's implied in the text. His level of contentment, no matter what the circumstances, no matter what pressure is trying to drag that level of contentment, happiness, motivation for life, whatever the pressure around me is trying to drag me out of that, it's very robustly protected. And you know why? Same reason yours can be too. Tom warned me that if I had a heavy hand... Tom, can you just flick it back if that's all right? Will that go back one from you? If I've broken the whole thing. Doesn't matter. Leave it there. It was it was the gospel. In case you missed it. Why is resilience for Paul robust? It's because of the gospel. And there were three. Here we go. Self-esteem, optimism, and perceived control. How worthwhile we feel as people. Everybody has a sense of worthwhile. For Christian folks, you must be worth something for Jesus to climb up on a cross. Now, if that is known, not sort of rolling around as some sort of thought bubble, but if that is known and it is by you, then that impacts how worthwhile we feel as a person. And not only just, it doesn't necessarily raise it, although it does, but if somebody comes along or some situation emerges that threatens your sense of being worthwhile as a person, then how can you touch it knowing that Jesus went to the cross? I often say this, there's not one more thing Jesus ever has to do for me. He's already done it by going to the cross. Not one more prayer has to be answered. I mean, he does that. Don't write me a note. You understand the point I'm trying to make with a little hyperbole. He does not have to get up in the morning and do one more thing for Linz. Not one more thing, because he rose and died on a cross. Because I'm worth it. Even on the days I don't feel worth it. Even on the days you might tell me I'm not worthwhile. Paul knew this. Very hard to drag self-esteem out of that. Optimism, hope. Those who hope in the Lord renew their strength. The gospel says something to our hope, something to our optimism when we think about the future, and perceived control. Obviously, the gospel says something like this. I've read every word of the book of Revelation. I remember at BCV, before it was MST, I think I was studying there. Andrew was in a class with me there. And I can't remember the lecturer, but I remember them summing up the whole purpose of the book of Revelation so simply but elegantly. I'll paraphrase. He said, you would look out the window and it was chaos. It just seemed Satan was in control. That's pretty depressing. Maybe not a lot's changed. Maybe Satan's in control. The book of Revelation is written plain and simple to say no. God is in control. Despite what it looks like at the kitchen window, God is in control. I've read the last page of this book and we are on the winning team. God is in control. Now, what does this gospel say to our sense of worthwhileness, our sense of hope for the future, our sense of being on side with a sovereign God who is under control no matter what the circumstances of our life? As hard, and I think that's what I really appreciated about Tom's prayer, there was an honesty there. There's nothing more concerning than someone chewing gum in the middle of a difficult circumstance, blowing bubbles like it's just nothing. Like it hurts. But we are on the winning team. Jesus died on the cross for us. When we focus our attention on him, it fosters hope because we're on the winning team as far as perceived control. God has it. It's very unusual that as a pastor of a church you would marry somebody and bury the same person. But I have, and I did. And I remember standing there at the wedding ceremony with this young man, and of course, like every wedding ceremony, hope was so thick on the carpet. It was just magnificent. So much wonderful thinking about the future. But then a number of years later, burying this man who had taken his own life very tragically, it occurred to me that somewhere between here and there, hope had evaporated. Now we'll know somebody. We will be close to somebody whose hope is being, at the very best, challenged now. The very worst of beginning to evaporate. Now, at Youth Dimension, as I said, honestly, I get up every single morning, and if there's one young person in a school that we can give hope to, in secular contexts, we can take the church with us into a school and bring Jesus so close that it's just a sideways glance to hope in the Lord, to renew hope. We're doing that. And I want you to do it as well. I've given you rocket fuel this morning. You may not realise it. Even just those three things are so fundamentally important. A sense of being worthwhile. If you know somebody, think of creative ways to remind them that they are worthwhile as people. Give them a sense of optimism and some way to control what's going on in their life. And you'll do all sorts of wonderful things. Ultimately, though, it is those who hope in the Lord that renew their strength. Next week is the big ticket week. I'm not exactly sure who the person is that's coming, but I do know it's the big ticket week because they're going to be talking about, as a faith community, how can we respond to somebody who's being dragged out of that and maybe stuck there for a while? How can we, and there's so many creative and wonderful ways that Croydon Hills Baptist Church can respond. And hopefully these will be unpacked very practically for you next week. So let me pray if that's all right, and I'll stop talking. So, Lord, we just acknowledge you as the source of our hope. We want to thank you for climbing up on a cross and dying for each one of us. And Lord, thank you that as Revelation 5 says, you are worthy to open the seals. As far as the future of this world goes, you're in control. So Lord, we just pause very humbly. We just say thank you, and we want to say we love you.